Hi there, I'm Lillian. Welcome to my channel. Here I help Christian wives heal their femininity so they can stop thinking like sons of God and start embodying their lives like His daughters. I talk about my own journey and how healing my feminine heart led me to the discovery that I was married to a type 3 man. That's the type of man that's a Nabal. If you don't know if you're married to a type 1, 2, or a 3 husband, you can find a link for that in the description box. Do you want to learn how to understand God's Word as a woman, heal yourself by His sanctification, and possibly transform your marriage by faith and knowledge? Then this is the place for you. Hi, beautiful sisters. Welcome back. And if you're new, thanks for stopping in. I'm going to start a conversation about sex, and more sex. I'll be unpacking it in 3 different sections over 2 videos. For today's video, I'll be talking about sections 1 and 2. Section 1 is about how God's divided up the sexual responsibility between husbands and wives in marriage. He calls it Due Benevolence. In section 2, I'm going to be presenting 7 points that come from a video that I watched. It perfectly shows the masculine mindset in its worst state when it comes to relationships and sex. It's called a misogynistic mindset. These 7 points will help you understand if you're hearing these kinds of ideas about sex from your husband or other wives, so that you'll know where they're rooted. That's in today's video. Section 3 is about emotional withholding. If misogyny and misinterpretation of Due Benevolence got together and had a baby, it would be called emotional withholding or emotional abuse. That's going to be in the second video. In this video, you'll learn what Paul truly meant by due benevolence in marriage and how it's different than the traditional male-centric interpretations. What qualifies as misogynistic thinking in marriage and how it distorts the true purpose of sex and emotional connection. Why emotional attachment is crucial for wives to desire sex. How a husband's investment in cleaving directly influences the sexual desire of his wife. Let's get started. The primary verses I'm going to use for this video are verses 1 through 4 from 1 Corinthians 7, but I'll need to start with the traditional interpretation of verse 9. Well, actually, I'm going to challenge the traditional masculine interpretation. The reason I'm starting with verse 9 is because over the years, it's the one that caused me a lot of confusion and grief. It didn't make sense when I considered it with verses 1 through 4. But no one could ever explain it to me, and because I was gullible, I just believed the church leadership when they said, sex is what you do in marriage. God gave men huge sexual appetites, so sex is just what you do. But you know what? They were wrong. Now that I understand it for myself, that's where I want to start with you all. Verse 9 says, "But if they do not have self-control, they should marry, since it's better to marry than burn with desire." The masculine mindset reads that and thinks, a man who wants to have unlimited and free access to sex should get married. That might be what those English words say, but that's not what Paul means here. He's not saying that because a man decides he's not going to exercise self-control, that instead he can bring that lack of sexual self-control and lay it before a woman and make it her responsibility. And he's not saying that marriage obligates a wife to feed a man's sexual entitlement. But you know what? Let's play it through. Let's assume that the English has translated it honestly. Just for the moment, let's assume it's exactly what Paul meant and accept it as truth. After marriage, a man's lack of self-control with sexual responsibility is now the woman's responsibility because she agreed to marry him. And so that entitles a husband to a veritable buffet of sexual favors. But if we're going to lean that hard into literal translation in one verse, you've got to do it for all verses. Let's stick with Paul and compare scripture to scripture. We'll take Ephesians 4:25. Here he says that you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully, not deceiving one another. Paul's stating the importance of transparency and truth when you're building community. Isn't marriage a community of two? So if there's problems with sex in the marriage, the questions should start with, did the man make this truth evident to the woman? Was he clear that it was going to be primarily a sex-based marriage, that the reason he was getting married was because of his lack of self-control? Was he transparent about the reason he was marrying her, and that as soon as they were married, it was going to become her responsibility to quench that in him 7 days a week for the next 30 to 40 years? No, I can guarantee you he did not, because no woman would sign up for that condition. Paul knows that about femininity. He's saying that marriage merely sanctifies the action of intercourse. That's it. He's not talking about quantity or quality. He's saying that within the covenant of marriage, sex is made holy and legal in God's eyes. That's all. Verse 9 simply means, if you're going to want to have sex and God is your father, it's going to cost you more than it costs people of the world. If you're chosen by God, things don't get easier, they get harder. It's how he sanctifies us. Christianity has completely misrepresented Paul's intentions, and as a result, Christian marriage is understood more like an unspoken agreement that's reduced to a sense of male-centric sexual entitlement. So we've been trapped because we listen to the same masculine interpretation, but in various forms of English translations, because we don't trust ourselves. And that means we fail to interpret the scriptures with our feminine heart and mind, using the original languages that God chose to speak to us in. So, because we don't know the truth, we get trapped in misogynistic thinking, believing that marriage is predicated on masculinity, sexuality, to the exclusion of the feminine creature. Let me define what I mean by misogynistic thinking. I don't mean by the fact of being a man that means you think like a misogynist, because there are women who think that way too. Let me tell you, there are lots of sisters touting the Proverbs 31 wife mantra. Women so brokenhearted that their girlish femininity is crushed under a huge payload of shame and self-loathing. They're the ones who embrace the relentless drive of the excellent wife mindset, fueled by every ounce of testosterone in their body, thinking they're being feminine. What I mean is that misogynistic thinking is to place the importance of masculinity above femininity. But more than that even, it's the primacy and power of masculinity pushing femininity into its shadow until she's minimized into inconsequential worthlessness.
You're just a silly girl.
When you push a one-flesh relationship into the roles that are strictly for the function of the marriage, the misogynist perspective increases. Masculinity assumes primacy over femininity by using the authority in his role to prioritize his needs and desires. This dominance leads to erasing the feminine feelings and emotions that live inside a wife's femininity. This forces all of a woman's femininity to disappear underneath the weight of masculinity. Because men have 90% testosterone, that's a lot of power, and women have only 10. A man's perspective dominates. So the interpretation of 1 Corinthians 7:9 becomes about the supposed greater desire. I say supposed because the female body has got a much larger capacity by design than men. It's just different. Let's look at verses 1 through 4 when Paul talks about due benefits. When you consider the words due benefit from a masculine mindset, and then you blend it with the image of the roles from my umbrella overlay, it makes it impossible to not think that the due benefit that Paul's talking about is just sex. And yes, he is talking about sex, yet at the same time, not just sex. Men and women both want sex, but estrogen arrives at the desire in the opposite way of testosterone. Men do good to feel good, and women feel good to do good. That means in relationship, masculinity is the doer and provider, so that femininity can be the receiver and the responder. No one would argue that men aren't visually stimulated, that it happens primarily in the cognitive region. They feel it in their groin, but it starts in their minds. The desire for sex goes from the mind to the groin and then finishes in the heart with the emotional experience happening after sex. Box 1, the mind. Box 2, the groin. Box 3, the heart. Men only think in boxes. Their process is always compartmentalized. For women, it's the opposite. We must feel an emotional attachment from the connection of cleaving before we desire sex physically. With masculinity having 90% testosterone and femininity being 90% estrogen, just that one biological fact proves that due benefits are fundamentally different between men and women. And that's why when Paul begins talking about due benevolence, he addresses the husband first. You must give the feminine creature what benefits her first. And then this is where it gets lost. The masculine mindset interprets due benefit for a wife as foreplay. It's not, because foreplay is part of sex. Think about it like this. For a man, due benevolence is like preparing the soil for planting. Foreplay is the tilling, watering, and fertilizing that leads to the harvest of intimacy. But for a woman, due benevolence is more like tending to the garden. It's not just about the planting, it's about the nurturing of the entire landscape. Friendship, connection, and attachment, so that the garden thrives as a whole. So, what's the benefit that's due to femininity? In short, it's everything except sex. The obligation that's due to a wife from the husband first is the benefit from the friendship and connection. You know what that is, right? That's cleaving. If your husband is a masculine male that's of quality, then he'll be cleaving to you on a regular basis. He'll be pursuing you and relationship with you. And that means you will be receiving your due benefits. If a man does this, he creates an incredibly powerful polarity. A husband who consistently pursues, engages with, and cherishes his wife, he's fostering a compelling and an almost irresistible desire within her. By intentionally loving her as Christ loves the church, he'll naturally draw her to want to be intimately connected with him. She'll respond to that consistent pursuit with the act of receiving any sexual advance. But femininity's got to experience his cleaving into her heart before she'll want to accept his body entering into her body. That's our pre-wiring from God for our safety, and it works unless you're unhealed. When we're unhealed, we fall for breadcrumbs instead of cleaving. I'm not going into breadcrumbs in this video, but suffice to say they're bad. I'll put a link in the description box if you want to do a deep dive into the difference between breadcrumbing and cleaving. So this is what God means in verse 4 when he says that a wife doesn't have power over her own body. She really doesn't, because when she's being cleaved to, she's basically putty in her husband's hands. Here's the difference between the two perspectives. Misogyny implies that I have control over your body because I am in the superior position. The husband sits above the wife, who's in the inferior position. With this perspective, you are powerless because the power is removed through the structure of the hierarchy. You don't have the power to say no because you have to submit. The structure of the hierarchy is being used as a tool to coercively control the body of the wife. Toxic masculinity leans hard into the visible roles in the hierarchical structure while ignoring the invisible one-flesh relationship. But healthy masculinity implies I don't need the authority in the structure of the roles because I have the masculine power to draw you to me through love. It's the same pattern in Ephesians 5:33. God knows how he created his daughters. He tells his sons, if you love your wife, she'll naturally respond with respect towards you. The power that a husband has is that it's his quality that determines the kind of sex life they have, because he's the one who determines her level of desire. 1 Corinthians 7 is ultimately telling us that it's the environment that creates the atmosphere for sex, and it's the husband's responsibility to intentionally create it. And that's why God says that the due benevolence for the wife is first. Misogyny thinks every aspect of marriage is packed into that hierarchical structure, including the woman and her femininity. But healthy masculinity, he knows that this feminine creature isn't sitting beneath him. He knows that she's positionally in front of him, facing him straight on, waiting, hoping to be drawn to him. Okay, in section 2, I'll be talking about those 7 insights from the video I mentioned. My goal with this video is to give you enough information that you'll be able to recognize when you hear teaching on relationships and sex that align with a misogynistic perspective. The reason this video resonated so much with me is because the creator has vividly illustrated exactly what misogyny sounds like. And these were all the things I heard about sex and marriage for almost 30 years. I thought about doing this as a reaction video, but it doesn't feel right to do that. It feels accusatory or even vengeful. God says the world is his business to leave them with him. It is a secular YouTuber, but the problem is that it's the same teaching that's found in the church. So I'm calling out the information, not the person. That's why I'm presenting it to you in this format. All right, let's get into it. First off, he sets a premise like he's making an appeal to women for their benefit. And we need to be wary of this kind of delivery. Whenever you hear instructions that are couched, like there's a benefit for you, your radar should go up. His video was prefaced by, "This one's for the ladies." Then he proceeded to request that you not believe the signals from your own body, and instead replace them along with your feminine needs and desires with the truths that he's about to share with you. Big, flaming red flag right there. Suppressing your emotions and feelings is the equivalent of saying, don't think about what I'm telling you, just accept it. It's exactly what Christian marriage counseling elders and a plethora of Christian marriage books also told me. Naively believing them, I did sell out my feminine heart, mind, and soul for the sake of masculinity. I don't want you to make the same mistake I did. I've outlined the 7 categories to be distinctly about us women, about our female sexuality. Sometimes I'll quote him directly, and sometimes I'll paraphrase, but I'll let you know. Number 1, misconceptions about the importance of sex to women. He says it's common knowledge that sex is more important to men than to women, that although women might enjoy some sex sometimes, it's a much less priority for them. Well, this is just wrong. It's actually fundamentally wrong. Sex is just as important to women. The proof of this is how God created our female bodies. He specifically designed us with a significant capacity for sexual enjoyment. We can experience prolonged sexual activity and multiple orgasms without needing to stop to rebuild our estrogen. We're like the song that never ends. We can go on and on and on. Plus, we've got extra parts, special parts, that have nothing to do with reproduction. We might get tired or pass out from exhaustion, but we never lose that huge capacity for sexual pleasure. Just this one fact alone tells me that God designed his daughters to have a considerable amount of pleasure from sex. Also, women have a unique ability to connect emotionally through sex. This creates a profound sense of intimacy and bonding that men don't experience. Yes, a man's oxytocin levels slightly rise after ejaculation, but it's short-lived. They have such high levels of testosterone that it makes sex more of a performance-based activity and less of an emotional connection. Women have an integrated experience that tightly links the emotional and physical. Men are influenced by different hormones. Their bond is the physical act itself, and that sits in one box. Remember, men process and think in boxes. So the emotional connection develops alongside the physical act, but in a different box. They're not intertwined together. Ignoring this integration in females reduces sex to a mere physical act, like a man experiences it. And it completely diminishes why and how sex is significant for the wholeness of femininity, her overall health, her complete mind, spirit, and body. Number 2, assumptions about female sexuality. Still saying that sex is more important to men, he lays a foundation by comparing a professional relationship with a personal one, saying that what works in business also applies to personal relationships. Then he addresses us again by saying, ladies, I'm going to try and explain to you why sex is so important to men. This burns me, because the intention behind his words are that if you, a woman, would just understand this basic reality, you'd offer free sex without any contribution from him to the relationship or investment into your femininity. As I mentioned in point 1, men experience sex in a compartmentalized way because that's how they were physiologically created. It's not something they choose. Similarly, our bodies are designed to experience sex in a fully integrated way, and we don't have a choice in that either. Be careful of marriage material that tries to convince you to sacrifice the intentional design God gave you. This perspective is all about what you can do for the man. It sounds almost like what Christians call a helper meet. What he's describing is how toxic men think. When you remove any investment into a female, you're no longer creating a personal relationship. So what happens when a wife doesn't receive any benefits of friendship and connection from her husband? The one flesh relationship can no longer exist for her. Instead, what she now experiences is the prostitution of her body, because sex without relationship is exactly that. The advice he's counseling women to follow is, exactly like the Christian marriage advice I received. Essentially, it wraps up the roles in the marriage together with the one flesh relationship, but it only keeps the masculine desires intact, not the needs and desires of femininity. It's bad for wives. It creates confusion because her desires seem to have been disappeared inside of his, that's to say, inside the roles. Yet, she still experiences all her feminine feels and emotions. This is fertile ground for abuse. Elevating masculine needs above feminine needs is the personification of misogyny. God intentionally created femininity from masculinity to be invested in and cared for and provided for. She wasn't created soft and pliable and adaptable so that masculinity could consume her. Number 3, reducing a wife to a single outcome. Next, he qualifies the professional relationship by receiving a paycheck, highlighting that it's the transaction of the money that's the defining feature. He's making the claim that because a business relationship and a personal relationship operate under pretty much the same parameters, that the only difference is the currency of exchange. In one, the currency is money. In the other, it's sex. What's happening in this perspective is that sex is being elevated to the highest level in the relationship, and I would argue that within short time, in a marriage like this, sex would soon become not just the top priority, but the only priority. When a husband regularly extracts from the deepest part of a woman with no investment into her femininity, sex has become the be-all and end-all of the marriage. Essentially, he's reduced his wife to the lowest common denominator, objectifying her as a functional creature for his own use. You know who thinks like that? Nabal. He had the same kind of acquisition mentality. He saw people as commodities to be used for his own gratification rather than as individuals with inherent value to invest into and care for. What this counselor is telling wives is that it's okay for a husband to define the quality of the marriage by how much sex he can get for himself with little to no investment into her or the relationship. He's telling you to let your marriage operate on the basis of something for nothing. But healthy masculinity doesn't operate on that kind of mindset. It functions based on the principle of earning rewards. Men feel good by doing good. The sense of satisfaction comes as the reward from the actions they do for others. Healthy men, not perfect ones, but healthy men, are natural doers and providers. Taking action is how they express their testosterone in the relationship. So, by removing any investment of connection a husband makes into a wife and replacing it with the outcome of sex, it's not that the romantic relationship is equivalent to a professional relationship. It's that a husband is creating the professional relationship out of the romantic one. He calls her a wife, but in this marriage, where sex is the main priority, she's got to respond like a prostitute. Sort of. It's a bad business model. I'll get to that in a bit. His comparison is flawed. A better comparison that would fit tighter and be more realistically aligned with this perspective on romantic relationships would be like someone skipping the initial investments, withholding interest contributions, yet still expecting to make regular withdrawals from a bank account. It's not reality. That's not all, though. Here's another reason this perspective of sex as the top priority just isn't in keeping with the reality of the comparison. He makes the point that in a professional relationship, I'm quoting him here, without receiving money, the relationship ceases to exist. People don't work for free. even if they're passionate about their work." End quote. He's right. People don't work for free. But he's starting his comparison in the wrong place. Because the truth is that if you don't put the 40 hours in first, there won't be a professional relationship that gives you the paycheck. So, for it to be a fair comparison to marriage, it would be more intellectually honest to say if a husband isn't going to invest into the femininity of his wife, there will be no sex life for him to make withdrawals from. God says if one isn't willing to work, let him not eat. When it comes to masculinity, work always comes before the reward. Number 4, the distortion of romantic relationships. He doesn't just say that money and sex are the primary currency for each of those relationships to continue. Now, he's trying to convince us ladies, that's in air quotes, that money and sex aren't just the mediums of exchange, but they're what actually creates the foundation of the relationship. We dipped into this in the previous point, but I want to challenge this idea from a different angle than before. By arguing that sex serves the same foundational role in marriage as a paycheck does in a job, you strip away the depth, complexity, and connection from the wife. Without those elements, her feminine heart has no way, zero pathway to emotionally attach. They're imperative. It's how she bonds herself to him. The main force for creating a healthy one-flesh relationship is the deep friendship and unwavering commitment between a husband and wife. That's what organically leads to sex. Without connection and bonding, there's simply no relationship. That's the due benefit I talked about in the previous section. In this context, sex is not the driving force or the primary objective of the relationship, and it certainly isn't the foundation. What sex is a natural outflow. It's the visible expression of the invisible closeness and connection that's been organically nurtured over time by consistent contribution from the husband. When a relationship is healthy, sex becomes a reflection of the truth and the reality of the love and commitment that's being shared. Sex is the result of living in the harmony of the interdependence that God intended by creating the female with the maximum opposing hormone. Genesis 2:21 through 22 and Ephesians 5:25 through 29. Number 5, the misogynistic perspective on romance and sex. Next, he qualifies a romantic relationship as your sex relationship. I'm going to quote him here so there's no misunderstanding. A romantic relationship is your sex relationship. End quote. You've heard me talk about the traditions of men in other videos. This is a perfect example of that mindset. It's misogyny. It fails to understand or it ignores that romance and sex are not separate elements for femininity. Instead, they're interconnected parts of the whole relationship, and they're sequential. Healed femininity seeks authentic connection for attachment. That will lead to sex. Then romance is created on its own. Romance isn't an action that's done for a woman, like it's not an outcome to be performed. It's a feeling inside the heart of femininity that grows because of consistent investments from the head into the body. Ephesians 5:29. The caveat here is that when your femininity is unhealed, you can get this order of sequence backwards. That's what happened to me. And then you end up becoming prey for every kind of toxic man who's not using his provider energy for relationship. Instead, he's using all his masculine power just for himself. The voice of misogyny says, I'm going to take the harvest from the field before the seeds are even planted. It's a mentality of consumption and depletion instead of nurturing and providing. It's the opposite order that's found in Ephesians 5:28a. And so that makes it backwards to the way God's ordered his world. God structured his world, including relationships, so that masculinity works first, then eats. This aligns with the way God ordered the due benefits in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 4. Her due benefit comes first as seeds that are planted. Then those seeds, they bring the harvest of his due benefit. Truly healthy masculinity plants the seeds and tends to the field that's going to create the bountiful harvest for him. Ephesians 5:28b. Number 6, the ignorance of female sexual arousal. To say it makes sense to prioritize a male's sexual requirements above a female's body, that's a high level of misogyny right there. He didn't say it exactly that way. I'll quote him. He says, it makes sense to prioritize sexual elements when considering entering into a romantic relationship. End quote. When you prioritize one need in a relationship, it logically means to deprioritize a different need in a relationship. So what he's insinuating is that a woman should deprioritize her necessity of emotional support, connection, attachment, and genuine, authentic friendship. For women, though, our integrated design, our bodies don't function that way unless we disconnect our heads from our hearts. For femininity, exclusive relationship is what naturally leads to exclusive sex. Disconnecting is the feminine counterpart to masculine compartmentalization. For a woman, this disconnection is not a natural state, though. It's a defense mechanism. It's how we're forced to live when we've got to survive situations where our emotional and mental and maybe even our physical safety could be at risk. Women are forced to fracture their integrated selves when they face extreme circumstances, like rape or regular abuse. I know, because it's how I survived a 30-year abusive marriage that included rape. In these moments, I mentally disappeared by detaching my mind from my body to protect my heart and sanity. My body was left present to be used, but I was emotionally numb. This dissociation isn't a sign of strength or empowerment or submission or respect. It's a trauma response to when you're being forced to live in a way that God never designed your estrogen to operate. Living in a dissociative state is unnatural. A woman annihilates her own femininity when she lives without the integration of her mind, heart, and physical presence. Whenever a wife has sex without the mental and emotional desire preceding intercourse, her body disassociates on its own. It believes it's in danger because the integration is not aligned with what she's experiencing. When you have sex and you don't want to, you end up creating trauma inside your body. You know how you can tell that you're creating trauma in your body? It's called faking pleasure for the man, or faking it. He might believe you, but you know it, and so does your body, because you can't lie to her. I'm going to dip back into the prostitute metaphor. Looking at a wife like she's only your sex provider reduces the complexity of an intimate relationship to a transactional model, like that of the business exchange of prostitution. Except for, he's suggesting you, a wife, give it away for free and get your confidence and committed relationships and friendships elsewhere, other than the one flesh relationship in marriage. Let's set aside the fact that this is a super toxic relationship model and see that it's also a failing model for business. Prostitutes don't even do that. They receive money for sex in their air quote professional relationships. If a wife isn't actually receiving any investment from masculine provision in their exclusive friendship, then she is in fact working for free. You've probably noticed that I've attached Bible verses along the way for the points. I don't have one for this depth of misogyny. If you can think of one, please share it in the comments. Number 7, the investment in femininity must precede sex. Treating a wife like she's some kind of exclusive sex dealer undermines the very essence of a woman. We're inherently relational beings. A woman needs connection that comes from attachment in order to even desire sex. I know I touched on this in the last point, but there's a significant amount of overlap in all of these points. When you tell a wife to prioritize her husband's masculine desires instead of embodying her feminine features that God gave her, you're actively encouraging her to participate in her own destruction. This pressure to suppress our natural design and compromise our emotional well-being leads to distorting our true identity, and it forces us to abandon the very essence of our femininity. By prioritizing the desire of masculinity at the expense of your own femininity, that leads you down a path that will ultimately erode your sense of self and the unique way God intended for you to experience sex and intimacy. In part 3, I'll be talking about how that destruction happens and what it looks like. When sex is devoid of genuine relationship, a woman is forced to shatter her heart as she's compelled to sever the vital connections between her mind, heart, and soul. Instead of embodying healed and integrated femininity, she sacrifices it. As he's sharing his perspective on sex, he consistently uses words like priority and requirements, but it seems like he doesn't have any idea about the basic biological priorities and requirements of the hormones that drive men and women. A man can have sex without even liking the woman, and it will have no effect on his mental and emotional health. But a woman can't do that. Our bodies aren't full of the hormone that allows for that choice. I'm not saying it's the right choice for men, and healthy masculinity doesn't choose to do that. I'm just saying that there's little to no effect because of the large quantity of testosterone. Where a man's body's got 90% testosterone, a woman's only got about 10%. Our bodies are full of estrogen, not testosterone. We don't bend that way. But the problem for us is that we try, and that's how we end up breaking ourselves and getting stuck in abusive relationships. Misogynistic thinking doesn't care about that. He thinks that a woman is supposed to sacrifice herself for a man. That's what a helper does. I heard it all the time. I was told that it was long-suffering for Christ. That's a lie, sisters. God wired his daughters to be repelled by any sexual advance unless her estrogen levels are increasing in the presence of the man who's doing the advancing. Only then will her body feel safe to attach through the connection that he's been creating. That's how cleaving works. I'm not talking about that in this video. I'll put a link in the description box if you want to hear more about cleaving. The investment a man makes in cleaving to his wife creates the environment where she'll naturally desire sex, just like a man's testosterone drives his desire. A man's testosterone can influence a woman's estrogen. He can make her estrogen behave like his testosterone when it comes to sexual desire. Let me explain using the example of vitamin D. We get vitamin D from some foods, but mostly from the sun. Vitamin D doesn't work right away. It needs to be activated by the body. First, it's converted in the liver, and then in the kidneys, and only then does it help your intestine absorb calcium. If there's not enough vitamin D, even though you could be eating lots of food that are loaded in calcium, your body won't respond with strong bones and teeth because it can't absorb the calcium properly. This conversion process is essential. In the same way, it's the man's masculinity that activates or converts a woman's estrogen to behave like his testosterone. This process is something he initiates. She can't do it on her own. Without his intentional contribution, it's never going to happen. Actually, it does happen. About 7-ish years into the marriage, and then she runs out of fake conversion. What does that mean? She can't pretend anymore. She simply no longer desires sex with her husband because he hasn't been investing his masculinity into her. If a man wants a woman to prioritize his sexuality, he's got to first create the environment that nurtures her desire to do that. It's actually covert abuse to demand or expect that she do this by herself. 1 Peter 3, verse 7. That's not part of the feminine features that God created her with. He's got to invest in her, into the emotional and mental aspects that speak to her personally and to her individual unique design. She's got to feel valued and safe, as if she is truly a part of his own body. She's got to be able to feel him connecting to her so that she can attach. A husband blaming a wife for not being interested in sex without examining his own negative contribution or his lack of positive contribution is unfair, unproductive, and it's sin against her. When a woman's emotional needs are intentionally overlooked or dismissed, it triggers a destructive cycle known as emotional withholding. This process gradually erodes the integrity of her feminine design, creating small but significant fractures in the relationship. In the next video, I'm going to get into the culmination of this misunderstanding of due benefits and the 7 points stemming from a misogynistic mindset. We'll look at how these misconceptions lead to emotional withholding in marriage. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I know your time is precious, and I deeply appreciate you spending it here. If something in the video spoke to your heart, or if you have any insights to share that could uplift another sister, please don't hesitate to share it here in the comments. Every like, comment, and share helps spread our message to sisters who might need encouragement in embracing their feminine heart and understanding God's design for their marriage. Bye for now, and I'll see you in the next one.